It started as a simple act of kindness, something anyone might do on a regular day without thinking twice. But for 12-year-old Jake, it was a small decision that would change everything. That evening, the air outside carried the crisp chill of autumn, and golden leaves danced along the sidewalk as Jake walked home from school. His backpack felt heavier than usual, not because of books, but because of the thoughts running through his mind. His mother had reminded him that morning about their elderly neighbor, Mr. Thompson, who had been sick for a few days. The old man lived alone in the small house at the end of the street, rarely seen except for occasional slow walks to his mailbox. "Why don't you take some soup to him after school?" his mother had suggested while stirring a pot on the stove. "It might cheer him up." Jake had nodded absent-mindedly, not thinking much of it at the time. But now, as he stepped inside his house and saw the warm container of soup waiting for him on the counter, he felt a small sense of duty. It wasn't that he knew Mr. Thompson. Well, in fact, he hardly knew him at all. The man had always seemed quiet, keeping to himself, and most of the neighborhood kids found him a little mysterious. There were rumors, of course. Kids talked about how he had once been a soldier, or a writer, or even a secret spy, but no one really knew the truth. Balancing the container carefully, Jake walked down the street toward Mr. Thompson's house. The porch light was dim, flickering slightly as if unsure whether to stay on. He hesitated for a moment before knocking. A soft shuffle was heard from inside, and after a few moments, the door creaked open just a little. Mr. Thompson peered through the gap, his wrinkled face showing both surprise and hesitation. "Yes?" His voice was raspy, weak. Hi, Mr. Thompson. My mom made some soup for you. She said it might help since you're not feeling well." Jake held up the container, suddenly feeling a little awkward. For a moment, the old man just stared at him. Then, with a slow nod, he opened the door a little wider. "That's very kind of you. Thank you, Jake." Jake hadn't expected him to know his name. He stepped forward, handing over the soup. As he did, he caught a glimpse inside the house. It was dimly lit, with old furniture and books stacked everywhere. A faint smell of dust and something else, maybe old paper, hung in the air. It felt frozen in time, as if the outside world had moved on. But this place had stayed still. "Would you like to come in for a moment?" Mr. Thompson asked, his voice quieter now, almost hesitant. Jake hesitated too. He hadn't planned on staying. But something about the moment made him nod. "Sure, just for a little bit." As he stepped inside, he noticed a small table near the window, covered in old photographs. Some were in black and white, others slightly faded with time. One in particular caught his eye, a younger Mr. Thompson, standing beside a woman and a little boy, both smiling. "Is that your family?" Jake asked, pointing at the picture. Mr. Thompson followed his gaze and let out a soft sigh. He picked up the photo, his fingers trembling slightly. "Yes, my wife and my son." His voice had a weight to it, a depth that carried something unspoken. Jake waited, sensing that there was more to the story, but Mr. Thompson only stared at the picture for a long moment before placing it back down. "Thank you for bringing the soup," the old man said finally, his eyes meeting Jake's. "It means more than you know." Jake nodded, unsure of what to say. There was something about the way Mr. Thompson looked at him. Something strange, almost like recognition. As he left the house and walked back home, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Mr. Thompson than anyone realized. And he was right, because the next time he visited, he would learn a truth that no one else in the neighborhood knew. A truth that would change everything he thought he knew about his quiet, mysterious neighbor. A few days passed before Jake found himself standing at Mr. Thompson's doorstep again. He wasn't sure why he had come back. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the way the old man had looked at him, as if he saw something in Jake that even Jake himself didn't understand. Either way, he was there, knocking lightly on the door, wondering if Mr. Thompson would even answer. The door opened, slower this time, and Mr. Thompson looked at him with a mix of surprise and something else, something unreadable. "Back again?" he said, his voice rough but not unkind. Jake shifted on his feet. "I just wanted to check on you, see if you were feeling better." A small smile appeared on Mr. Thompson's face, faint but genuine. He stepped aside. "Well, if you're here, you might as well come in." Jake hesitated only for a moment before stepping inside again. The house was just as he remembered, dimly lit, quiet, filled with old books and even older memories. The smell of soup still lingered in the air, though the bowl his mother had sent was now empty, sitting neatly on the counter. "You like the soup?" Jake asked, glancing at it. "It reminded me of something I hadn't thought about in a long time," Mr. Thompson murmured, taking a seat in his worn-out armchair. "My wife used to make soup like that. Same smell, same taste." Jake sat down across from him, feeling the weight in Mr. Thompson's words. "What happened to them?" he asked carefully, glancing back at the framed photo on the table. For a long time, Mr. Thompson didn't speak. His fingers traced the arm of his chair, absent-mindedly, his gaze distant. Then with a sigh, he finally answered, "They were gone before I ever got the chance to fix things." Jake frowned. "Fix what?" Mr. Thompson leaned forward, resting his hands on his knees. His voice was quieter now, as if he was sharing a secret no one else had ever heard. "I wasn't always alone, Jake. I had a family, a wife I loved more than anything, and a son I let down." Jake swallowed, sensing the heaviness in his words. "What do you mean?" Mr. Thompson took a slow, shaky breath before continuing. "I made mistakes. I spent too much time working, chasing things that didn't matter. I thought I had all the time in the world to make it right, but life doesn't wait. One day, they were gone, and all I had left were these old photographs and regrets." Jake felt a knot form in his stomach. He didn't know what to say. He was just a kid. What could he possibly say to someone who had lost everything? But before he could even try, Mr. Thompson looked at him again, and for the second time, Jake saw something strange in his eyes. That same look of recognition. "Jake," he said slowly, "you remind me of him." A chill ran down Jake's spine. "Your son." Mr. Thompson nodded. "You look just like him when he was your age. The way you talk, the way you carry yourself. It's like looking into the past." Jake didn't know what to do with that. The room suddenly felt smaller, the air heavier. He glanced at the photo again, studying the boy standing next to Mr. Thompson in the picture. The resemblance was there, subtle, but there. A strange feeling settled in Jake's chest, a mixture of curiosity and something else he couldn't quite name. What happened to him? Mr. Thompson hesitated, then stood up and walked over to an old wooden box sitting on a shelf. He opened it carefully and pulled out a folded letter, the edges worn with time. He held it for a long moment before handing it to Jake. "This was the last thing he ever sent me," he said quietly. Jake unfolded the letter carefully, his hands suddenly feeling unsteady. The handwriting was faded, but still readable. As he scanned the words, his heart began to pound. The letter spoke of a boy who had left, feeling like he had never been enough for his father. A boy who had wanted to make things right, but time had gotten in the way. A boy who had always wondered if his father had ever really cared. And then Jake reached the end of the letter, where the boy had signed his name. His breath caught in his throat. The name on the letter was his father's. Jake's hand shook as he looked up at Mr. Thompson, his mind struggling to process what he had just read. The old man was staring at him, his eyes filled with something Jake couldn't quite describe. Hope, pain, longing. Jake, Mr. Thompson whispered, his voice barely above a breath. Your father. He was my son. The room went silent. Jake felt the world shift beneath him. Like everything he thought he knew had just changed in an instant. Mr. Thompson wasn't just his neighbor. He was his grandfather. Jake felt his chest tighten as he stared at Mr. Thompson. His grandfather. The words echoed in his mind, but they didn't quite feel real yet. His grandfather. The man who had lived down the street all this time. His throat was dry when he finally spoke. My dad. He never told me about you. Mr. Thompson looked down at his hands, his expression heavy with regret. I don't blame him, he sighed. I hurt him, Jake. I wasn't there the way a father should be. I was too focused on work, too stubborn to listen when he needed me most. By the time I realized what I had lost, it was too late. He left and we never spoke again. Jake's mind raced. He had always known his dad didn't talk much about his childhood, but he had never questioned it. It had just been one of those unspoken things in their family. But now, sitting in Mr. Thompson's quiet house, everything made sense. The distance, the silence, the missing pieces of his father's past. Did you ever try to find him? Jake asked. Mr. Thompson nodded slowly. I did. I wrote letters, but he never wrote back. I tried calling, but he never answered. I wanted to fix things, but he had already moved on. And after a while, I figured maybe he was better off without me. Jake swallowed hard. He thought of his dad, the man who had always been there for him, the man who had never once mentioned having a father of his own. He wasn't better off without you, Jake said quietly. I don't think he ever stopped thinking about you. Mr. Thompson's eyes glistened, but he quickly looked away. I wish I could believe that. Silence filled the room, thick with years of unspoken words. Jake felt the weight of it, but beneath it all, he also felt something else, an opportunity. You should talk to him, Jake said suddenly. Mr. Thompson let out a sad chuckle. It's been too long, Jake. I wouldn't even know what to say. Just start with hello, Jake said. That's what you said to me when I knocked on your door. Mr. Thompson looked at him for a long time, as if seeing him in a new light. Then, finally he nodded. All right, he said. All right. That evening, when Jake got home, he sat across from his dad at the dinner table, his heart pounding. He had never been nervous to talk to his dad before, but this felt different, bigger. Dad, he said carefully, do you remember our neighbor, Mr. Thompson? His father froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. His expression shifted. Surprise first, then something deeper. Yeah, he said slowly. What about him? Jake took a breath. I think you should go see him. His dad set his fork down, his jaw tightening. Jake, he's your dad, Jake said before his father could say anything else. I know you don't talk about him, and I know there's a reason for that, but he's right there, Dad. And I think he's been waiting for you. His father didn't say anything for a long time. His eyes were distant, like he was sifting through old memories, ones he had locked away a long time ago. When he finally looked at Jake, there was something different in his expression. Hesitation, maybe even fear. I don't know if I can, he admitted. Jake reached across the table and placed his hand on his father's. I think you should try. The next day, Jake walked his father to Mr. Thompson's house. He didn't go inside with him. This was something they had to do on their own, but as he stood outside, hands in his pockets, he heard the door open. He heard his father's breath hitch, heard the pause before he finally spoke. "Hi, Dad." And then, after a long, long moment, he heard Mr. Thompson's voice, quiet and filled with years of longing. "Hello, son." Jake smiled to himself and walked away, letting them have their moment. He had knocked on Mr. Thompson's door that first day, thinking he was just delivering soup, but he had ended up delivering something much more important: hope, forgiveness, and a second chance. And sometimes, that was all it took to change everything.